The PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X are approaching their 3-year anniversary for release. It's hard to believe that it's been so long, but finally software is really starting to take full advantage of the consoles and really show us what they are capable of. Alan Wake 2 looks absolutely phenomenal across both machines, let alone of course the PC visuals with things like path tracing, but also Spider-Man 2 with the I/O capabilities of the PlayStation 5 really being taken full advantage of, plus honestly some of the best ray tracing that I personally have ever seen on a console. It honestly just looks spectacular, particularly when you think about the scope and size of the city itself. But yes, obviously, there are a lot of rumours concerning the PlayStation 5 Pro. In many ways, it seems very similar to the lifecycle approach that Sony followed with the PlayStation 4. For example, the CPU IP, like the PlayStation 4, used basically the Jaguar CPU cores and then just essentially enhanced them a little bit for the PS4 Pro. It seems to be doing much the same with the PS5 Pro, with Zen 2 being used in both consoles, albeit with some tweaks and higher clock frequencies. GPU performance is obviously going to see a major uptick. But as you probably guessed in this video, I want to talk to you guys about some information that I've been hearing, particularly on the manufacturing process and some other bits and pieces. And the timing for all of this is quite interesting. Again, talking about Spider-Man 2, the game is a technical marvel on the base console, but also offers some very interesting resolution and frame rate options, and it's not too difficult to imagine a patch which could be released for the PS5 Pro which cranked up level of details, perhaps increased the number of bounces for RT, or maybe even additional objects or something like that that would be included in the RT pass, but also naturally increase the frame rates, resolution, etc, etc. But outside of the technical stuff, Sony itself is definitely in a very transitional period. Obviously Jim Ryan is stepping down, and it's going to be very interesting to see how Sony's approach differs going forward with games, for example, like games as a service, also ports to the PC, as there have been some job openings that have been posted, which really seem to indicate that Sony will be stepping up PC ports, but which games, how long of a delay, etc, etc, honestly, only time will tell. Well, with all that said, enough rambling from me, let's just get on with it. So let's start things out with some of the information, and that is allegedly the PS5 Pro's APU. The code name for this is probably Viola, although of course this has not been officially confirmed, will almost certainly be produced on TSMC's 6nm process and not 5. Now I have to say, this is actually quite surprising to me, as some of the earlier information I was hearing about the PS5 Pro is actually to the contrary. It was going to be using 5nm, but allegedly this is just not the case, and a couple of my really good sources are now telling me it's 6nm. Now it's still possible this is just not true, but at this point I think it probably is. So for those of you who have been following the base model system, you'll know that the original model was leveraging an APU code named Oberon, and the newer model PlayStation 5s have been using Oberon Plus. Skyjuice over Astronomics have actually done a really good breakdown on the Oberon Plus APU, but it is of course identical in specification to the base model system. It's got nothing to do with the Pro. The major difference of course is that Sony basically increased the density of the silicon, i.e. it's just crammed into a smaller space. In 6nm's case, it's improved by about 18% over the N7 process we saw the base model PS5 launch with. Now, I've been hearing through the grapevine the PS5 Slim will still be using the same 6nm process and pretty much the same Oberon Plus APU as well. But getting back to the PS5 Pro, yeah, it's allegedly going to be using 6nm process and not 5nm. And this is quite interesting because this would obviously mean that they wouldn't be getting so much of a power reduction and reduction in heat and other things that they could be if they were using the smaller, more refined process. Now the rumour is that the PlayStation 5 Pro's CPU is still Zen 2. This is what I've reported, and honestly it does make sense from a developmental standpoint. Early rumours that I was hearing is that the system was going to be using Zen 4, but I don't know if that was misinformation or whether Sony just simply decided that Zen 4 wouldn't be ready in time because of bring-up times, or it's also quite possible that they kind of decided it's just not worth the engineering efforts, because ultimately the Pro system is really going to be focusing of course on offering higher resolution, ray tracing and other things. My assumption is that we're still going to be seeing variable clock frequencies to the GPU and CPU, and Sony will probably still cut the FP units, for example the AVX instruction set that we saw in the vanilla console. Now this is not confirmed, I don't know that about the PS5 Pro, but I don't think they're going to change anything so big. Basically, Sony just didn't want heavy AVX usage for the PS5. Instead, they decided that it was a much more logical thing for basically GPU compute. Now, as far as I'm aware, RDNA 3's workgroup processors are denser than RDNA 2 in general. The PS5 SoC is pretty small. It's 308 mm. The original 7nm variant, of course. This is compared to the Xbox Series X's 360 square millimeters, which of course, like the base model PS5, is also using RDNA 2 and also of course on the 7nm TSMC process. Roughly speaking, from Oberon, the original PS5 SoC on the 7nm process, to Oberon Plus 6nm, again, all the same specifications. The cut is from just over 300 square millimeters down to around 260. Again, this is report over at Astronomics. What does this really mean? Well, we don't know the full configuration of the PS5 Pro's APU. For example, are there extra memory controllers? This is particularly true because one rumour I've been hearing, as well as some others online, is that there's DDR5 support for OS, that type of thing. Is there extra cache on board? Have we seen other changes to the APU that we just simply don't know about? But honestly speaking, it's not impossible that Sony could have an APU which by and large is roughly the same size as the Xbox Series X's current APU. Now we can get a rough idea of how 6 and 7 are compared with an RDNA 2 and 3 based GPU by turning our focus to N33. I'm going to be using Tech Power up here for our easy comparisons, but rounding up and down, we're seeing 240 shrink down to 200 square millimeters. N33's shader configuration is identical, 32 compute units, and we also have an equal number of TMUs and ROPs. Now my guess is that, of course, we're going to see way more compute units for the PS5 Pro, we'll get more into that in a moment, and TMUs and ROPs will also increase as well, but this just gives you a general idea of how a comparatively spec'd GPU would scale from RDNA 2 to RDNA 3. Now, there's also, of course, some other changes as well, like L0 and L1 cache doubled for RDNA 3, and it's also a little more tricky because Sony would do a lot of custom work for their GPU structure, meaning exact comparisons against a desktop just aren't possible, not least of which because, again, I do not personally know everything that was done for the PS5 Pro. But it does demonstrate that, in terms of a GPU portion anyway, a similarly spec'd RDNA 3 GPU is smaller on the 6nm process by a decent margin, so Sony probably wouldn't need to have some gigantic 500 square millimeter chip. They would, however, probably need a more robust cooling system to the PS5 Slim, but again, it's quite difficult to know what optimization they're doing in silicon. Now, obviously speaking, larger dies do also represent other problems, for example, defect rates of chips. If we look at the Xbox Series X, for example, there's 56 compute units on the die, but they have 52 enabled. The PS5 does pretty much the same thing. There's 40 compute units on the die, but again, 4 of those are disabled, leaving 36. Now, my current understanding for the PS5 Pro's APU, we're looking, and I would suggest you look at the screen here if you want a more in-depth thing. I'm not going to read out all of this stuff because I'll be here for the next year, but basically 8 2 cores. They're customized by Sony, RDNA 3 based hybrid. I'm getting a lot of mixed information regarding exactly what the technology is. There's still almost certainly going to be the custom geometry engine that Sony are using, maybe with some improvements, etc, etc. 30 workgroup processors are enabled out of 32. So these are split into 2 shader arrays, and this means that there's 16 workgroup processors each. However, again, one of these has been disabled in each shader array, so 30 out of 32, allegedly. The clock frequency low 4 GHz for the CPU, 2.5 to 2.8 GHz for the GPU. The clocks are not set yet, and this won't be until closer to retail. The memory, allegedly, is 18,000 MTS. Now, the number of workgroup processors, as well as the memory configuration has been essentially leaked as well by Tom Henderson, and this does match with what my sources were saying even prior to this. I kind of hinted a couple of times in videos to the workgroup processor number, but I was asked to not specifically say it, but I did in a couple of videos mention 30. But anyway, that's 576 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, which leads to some interesting questions, which we'll get to in a moment. Potentially DDR5 memory. I'm hearing 4 gigabytes may be on board for the OS, but I'm hearing conflicting information there. There's also potentially going to be a beefed up Tempest engine, and again, the manufacturing process, which I'm not going to repeat. Now, RDNA 3 also offers some challenges in how we're talking about T-flops. T-flops are a very, let's say, not good method of calculating performance when it comes to graphics, particularly when we're talking one architecture to another. And this is even truer when we're talking about RDNA 2 to RDNA 3. This is because of dual issue ALUs. Now, this is a really extensive topic, and I won't go into it fully here because I've already spoken about this a lot before RDNA 3 released for the PC. But basically speaking, it specifically affects how floating point operations are performed. If you want more information, I'll leave a link in the video description, and you can also check out Chips and Cheese's blog, which we're going to discuss more in just a second as well. Now, whether Sony incorporates this or not, I don't know, and it's also going to be very interesting to see what other changes the PlayStation 5 Pro's caching system would incorporate. For example, there's probably going to be changes to the L1 and L0 caches, which are generally baked into the RDNA 3 architecture, but whether Sony have shrunk those or not, I don't know. But is there also just more cache in general on the chip? I don't think they would go infinity cache kind of thing, like 32 or 64 megabytes, but honestly I don't know. I've heard so many mixed things on that, and no one can give me an exact answer. However, from my understanding, and again, Chips and Cheese did a really good analysis on this, but it was relevant to the desktop. They were comparing the 6900 XT versus the 7900 series for the desktop. But to my understanding, VLIW2 really does take a lot of bandwidth. Now, basically speaking, for the GPU on the desktop, it boils down to register sizes, and they're not increased essentially enough. Now, this is definitely something that Sony could do with the PS5 Pro. Again, I don't know all of the details, but the dual issue system is quite dependent upon compilers as well. So it's very possible that game developers won't really leverage this too much. There's also RDNA 3.5, which adds a lot of questions as well. Now, RDNA 3.5 does exist, but it's not a refresh for the desktop. Instead, it's going to be for APUs such as Sarlacc. I've discussed Sarlacc a ton of times before on the channel, but it's going to be for things like, laptops. But it's RDNA 3.5, which contains some elements of RDNA 4, which is going to release next year for the desktop, and it also contains Zen 5. Now, I've leaked a lot of details about RDNA 3.5, Sarlacc, and of course Zen 5 before, but there are tons of improvements to Salus. I think there's some geometry engine stuff as well, but that's not related to the PS5. So what they do with the IPs for the console is going to be really interesting. I don't, however, want this video to wander too much into the realms of guesswork and speculation for this stuff, because there's still a lot of questions that I simply do not have answers to. Instead, what I want you guys to think of is the PS5 being designed to focus on what you would expect it to be focused on, improving resolution, frame rates, and visuals, and really just empowering the developer. The best way, if you've got kind of a technical mind, to kind of think of the PS5 versus the PS5 Pro, is to say to yourself, well, these are the current specifications and abilities of the PS5. What would be easy knobs, and easy is kind of very relative when it comes to this type of stuff anyway, but what would be specifications and things that Sony could change which would be relatively easy for games developers, to easily be able to tweak and improve visuals and get maximum performance and visual return for gamers without having to completely and utterly essentially think of a new generation console. Now, of course, that with the real improvements are going to come with the PlayStation 6 and next generation Xbox. So yeah, the PlayStation 6 is really going to be where, of course, Sony debuts the next generation console technology. It's going to be extremely interesting to see some of the innovations that I think Sony will be bringing to the forefront. In a nutshell, AI, physics, machine learning, all of that stuff is going to be definitely present. And of course, Microsoft will do much the same thing. Sony as a company, of course, are not shy to make big, bold decisions, just like Microsoft and Nintendo as well. Ultimately, this is a very competitive marketplace. I will be super interested to see what happens with PC ports going forward as well. Obviously, there are some really big games that still haven't seen PC ports, for example, Demon's Souls. And so it's going to be extremely interesting to see how Sony's approach differs in the future. My guess with the PlayStation 6, based upon all of the information that I've been hearing, they're still going to be sticking with AMD. And honestly speaking, I think it does make a lot of logical sense. I feel that games are going to be really evolving now over the next couple of years as we start to take full advantage of the hardware and what it can actually bring to the table. Obviously, the new Unreal Engine is really starting to get fully utilized as well. Even Capcom seems to be throwing its hat into the ring with game engines. Obviously, they have at the moment the RE engine, but that which is used internally for games like, well, Resident Evil 4. But they seem very keen on making that more publicly available, or should I say developer available to more studios, and it is a phenomenal engine. So I will be very curious to see what happens going forward in the game industry. With that said, guys, hopefully you have enjoyed this video. If you did, you know what to do. It's YouTube. Leave a like and, of course, subscribe if you haven't. There will be a lot of very interesting content over the next couple of days and weeks on the channel. Unfortunately, I was just kind of nursing like a horrible cold. Like a couple of my friends also seem to get it. Just sucks, unfortunately, living in London, that type of thing. But I'm back to, well, relatively good health, apart from you might see a bit of dry skin on my nose. Apologies for that. But anyway, take care of yourselves. Have an amazing day. Bye for now.